So from the start, d4, d5, bishop f4, c5, and knight c3 is met by knight c6. e3, we take the pawn, and then pawn has to take back. Now bishop f5. We've been covering the knight b5 attempt move a little bit too much, so it's time to drop it. But at least now we know exactly how to respond to every single case in which it can appear. We will also talk about that in the Veresov, in which it happens to be a more serious attack. So we're going to have to go through the two main moves, which is knight f3 and bishop d3. Knight f3 will come later on. I'm going to start with bishop d3, which is the one I used to find more annoying. So as we saw before, we had a position where the knight was in f3 and the bishop was asking for a swap in d3, but we went to g4, pinning the knight. But that was because we had an idea of doubling up and isolating the pawn, or if white moves the queen, we take the pawn in d4 with the knight. And right now, though, the situation is different. We can't go to g4, and we neither want to go back. So the best move by black now here is to take the bishop. So, well, okay, pawn takes is not possible because that drops a pawn and it's just a stupid isolated pawn. Queen takes back, white develops a piece, and black continues with e6, regular move and the best way to develop this bishop. Knight f3 is met by knight f6, so these positions are going to be easy to remember because the moves are very standard. You know, we're not playing any fancy moves. After castling, black develops as well. You will have no problems remembering this position. Let's have a look at the main move right now, which is knight to e5. Now, we don't want to take the knight because after the pawn takes back, we're going to have to remove the knight from f6. And even going to d7, we're never going to have enough attack on the e5 square. So this is a pattern, one of the patterns that has to be recognized. Taking and takes back will make this knight move again. And we're never going to take this pawn, and also the freedom of this bishop will be massively reduced. So we don't want that to happen. So after knight e5, we play queen to b6. Also, it's important we don't want to produce a backwards pawn. For example, if knight takes and pawn takes, this pawn in c6, I don't really like it. I want to play queen b6, it's more accurate. Okay, so let's just mention a few ideas here on how to continue this and go to a winning endgame. So knight a4 simply is met by queen d4, right? That's a free pawn. There's no compensation for that. That knight isn't going anywhere. So if the white player was thinking of playing knight a4 to protect b2, that's a blunder. A move like knight to c6 is met by queen takes. Of course, we don't want to create a backwards pawn. And we're also going to start putting pressure on the c square. So remember, in the knight c3 London, this pawn will be targeted eventually. That's why you know it's not nice to block the c pawn with your own c pawn. So we're going to be targeting that weakness later on. Queen to c6, and now there's plenty of moves available. Let's just see how things will look like after rook f to e1, for example. We castle. These are very regular moves, and the other rook reaching the central file, for example. Now we play rook f to c8. So, and I want you to understand that we would have played rook f to c8 anyway, even if white had played something else. I'm just playing some regular moves. So here's the thing. We are putting pressure on the c3 square. This is the weakness. If there's anything that you learn from this video, is that whenever you will face the London system where they play knight to c3, just remember the following things that we've been going through, but I will repeat them right now. We're going to have a bishop that will go to b4, pin the knight to this square, either to the king or the rook, since the rook is there. We're going to play knight to c6 and then bishop f5 as soon as possible in the opening, as we did, so that we can put the rook in c8 to attack this file. This c2 square is going to be a weakness. These are all the principles you need to know against this type of London system. We're going to go there. We're going to go to c3 eventually. We're going to play bishop b4. We're going to take until we end up with an extra pawn and the better placed rooks, and we will place the rooks in the second rank. That's what we're going to be doing. This is unstoppable. There was nothing that white could have done. Also, because think about it, this move a3, for example, is simply met by bishop takes, and we win a pawn. If pawn takes back, we go here. So the white player cannot play a move like a3. He can't even prevent this from happening. And a move like a3 b4 is so slow that we will have time to play rook f to c8 and go for the knight. So best move by white now is rook to e2 to unpin the knight if the knight were to get pinned by the bishop. Black continues with best move h6 in this situation, and well, this is white playing the most accurate moves in this type of variation. So the knight c3 isn't supposed to be the best line. This is just white playing the absolute best moves, and black still has a lead, but we have to play accurate here. So now we know what type of plan we're going for. After h6, the idea of the black player is simply to make this knight unpinnable. so the bishop doesn't have access to g5. So if black were to play again now, we will have a simple plan: a6, b5, and then b4. The white knight will have to move, can't go to any of these squares anywhere here. He will have to go to b1, and we can infiltrate our queen to attack on the pawn. And after the pawn moves, we can take and then eventually join, and then play rook to c4 and then rook to c8, doubling up the attack and taking control of the file. White is in some sort of zugzwang. I'm perfectly aware we don't get to move more than one move in a row, but that's the plan we're going for. After h6 is white to move. White's best move is bishop to e5, since that allows the white player from potentially playing f4, f5 after the rook has rejoined this side of the board. So after bishop e5, black goes on with the plan, which is a6. White doesn't really have many moves now. I'm just going to take a move as an example, like rook d to e1, and how we will continue. As we said already, as black, we're going to beat this type of London system on the c file by gaining control of the c file, since the c file has not been, since the d4 pawn has not been backed up by the c pawn, but it's rather blocked by the knight. So now we play queen to c4. We're really confident swapping stuff, and the position might look like a completely normal position where a lot of things can happen, but black is completely confident to win the endgame. The reason is that we have control over the square c3. The pressure that we will apply on the square c3 is so that we know for sure that we're going to be more active. Queen c4, if the queen were to take, we could take back. This rook cannot be removed from c4, because then b3, we just take the knight, and if the knight moves, we're just going to double up the rooks and we're going for the pawn. So let's have a quick look on how we consolidate the advantage in the case that the white's best move now is queen to e3. But let's see what happens if queen takes, right? We take back, and in this position, how do we consolidate the advantage? We are simply exploiting the fact that this knight will have to move at some point, and we are threatening bishop to b4, taking this knight and winning material. Pawn takes, rook takes, and the rooks will be dominating after rook c8. Again, this pattern here, let's remember, e3 is not possible because you can just take it and then the knight is free. Well, you won a pawn. So after knight moves away, and white can try an attempt of rebuilding the pawn structure, well, although he should have played c3 at the very beginning. The knight cannot go anywhere else, by the way. Let's just mention that. Knight d1 is also possible. This is how we continue the game. We play b5. And after c3, we play a5. The simple goal is to open up these pawns. So move like b4, for example, and infiltrate rook. If pawn takes, then pawn takes back. We got the rook up. A move like knight to d2, for example, is just met by rook c6. We're still controlling the file and planning to lift up the rooks. And now black enjoys a lovely position, because think about it, what can white do? He can't push the b pawn without losing the c pawn. He can't push the a3 pawn because of b4. Now we can all understand why. Because that allows our rooks to both be free. So for example, pawn up. We're doubling attack on a3 pawn. We take, we up a pawn. If they take us, we take back. And we're doubling the attack on the c pawn. If they take, we're up a pawn, right? And if they take us, again, we're going to be able to place the bishop and the rook, and then the rook as well here. We're completely winning, right? This is going to be an easy endgame. So back in his position, white can't take, I mean, he can't take the knight, but then after we take back, we're playing an open endgame with the bishop against the knight. The pressure that we're making on the c3 pawn allows us to, let's say, for example, bishop takes. We're always going to be putting pressure on this pawn no matter what, or we will be forcing the opponent to play rook to c1, confining the rook to a role of defending a pawn. But even then, a move like b4 is thematic in this situation. We're planning to take. We have double attack on the pawn. If the pawn takes us, we could be winning the central pawn and infiltrating the rook. So that's also not good. In this position, let's have a look at this move, like knight f3, fairly normal move, keeping an eye on e5. This is met by knight to d7. And now try to remember this pattern. We want to leave things like this because we don't want the knight to go to e5. So we're not going to take the bishop and allow this knight to be pretty annoying over there. And also will come with a tempo on the rook. Right now our plan is simply b4. Start putting pressure on the c3 square, doubling up the rook, and go for what we've been trying to go for the whole time. The reason why we haven't gone through that yet is because I've made white play the best moves. But if you remember these patterns, you will be in control of the game. So right now we have a threat of b4, and white's best move is a3. Let's have just a quick look at the scenario where the white player doesn't see this because he thinks that can be defended. Let's just see how our bishop is better than our opponent's bishop, because this bishop is on some is got like basically almost every white pawn is in the same color of this bishop. So although this bishop is not even the worst in the world, it's not even the best. So if we could go on with our move now, let's say this is our plan, right? We want to know our plan. And let's have a look at this type of scenario. Rook to c2, right? We take the pawn and we're creating a backwards pawn. If rook takes, pawn takes, then we've got the rook coming here and putting more and more pressure on the pawn. The pawn will not be able to push because we have a pawn in d5 attacking there. So after c3, we double up the rook, and that's it. We're just going to go there. We're just going to take it. And rook c1 is met by bishop a3. So the rook will have to move away. And so for this reason, in this position, the best move is a3. Right, so this is to assume that you will literally play against stockfish. If you've watched this video and you've understood all the principles we discussed about the C file and how the setup looks like, chances are that right now you're just in a massive advantage. And even though white just played the best move, which is a3, we're still gonna play b4. We have double attack on the c3 pawn, the all-time weakness of this type of London system. White takes, we take back, and if they don't take, we still have double attack. If rook goes to c2, then we know what we're doing, rook c8 and so on. We just saw that. And if pawn takes, then it's just isolating a pawn. There's no compensation for white. We're infiltrating our rooks now. The bishop comes with an attack on the rook, so we're winning a tempo. The rook moves. After the rook moves, we have this lovely g5 move with the thematic g4 move. That's the idea, because when the knight moves, so let's say knight to d2, for example, will allow the infiltration of the rooks. Knight to h4 is going to a square where the knight will have no access anywhere else, so that doesn't make sense. Knight to e1 is taken by the bishop, and after the d rook takes back, because the e rook doesn't want to allow the infiltration of the black rook. After the rook takes back, we can take, and now we don't have to care whether white takes with the pawn or with the rook, because we have this stable and safe pawn structure, whereas white has an isolated pawn which we will target with the two rooks, and we're winning like that. And so in order to prevent the g4 move, something like h3, for example, is met by knight takes. But after knight takes, it comes with an attack on the rook. We move the rook, and black has a solid advantage simply because of this isolated pawn. Our goal is to play bishop to d6 and go for what we did before, the idea to take the knight. If the knight were to move, we're still going to double up the rooks and go for this pawn. So I want to make the last recap just to prove how this is easy to remember and how most moves are forced. So d4, d5, bishop f4, we play c5, and white goes for this knight c3 move. We play knight to c6, and now white goes through to e3. Next video I'll go through e4. We take the pawn takes back, only move, and now bishop to f5. Bishop to d3 now is met by bishop takes, queen takes. Now we play e6, knight f3, knight f6. Couldn't be easier to remember. Castle, bishop e7. Knight e5 now, queen to b6. We don't want to create a backward pawn. We're attacking the pawn in b2 as well. And now earlier we went through knight a4 and knight c6. We chose knight c6 because that was the best. So knight c6, take the queen. The London system player has to blame only himself for being in this situation, because this knight c3 move is what gave no freedom to his pieces, because usually they want to play these moves like they will play c3, knight to d2, pawn can push to e4 eventually, depending. The pawn in e3 can push to e4. They have access to f3 or b3. The queen has got access to this diagonal. But in this variation with the knight in c3 here, after the swap of the bishop in d3, the thing is, what can white do? Just basically nothing. There's not much. I mean, you can hang around with the bishop and then just have a walk around. The knight isn't going anywhere because the c5 square is controlled twice, and it will be controlled 3 times. And there are no open files except the e file, but it's closed by a pawn chain of the black player. So after rook f2 e1, it just doesn't even seem that white has done any improvement. So castle, and the other rook tries to come into the game. Rook f to c8. So here we are, same position as before. We mentioned that a3 is wrong because we can take it for free. We have an attack on the c3 knight. We're winning a pawn. So best move by white now is rook to e2, start putting pressure on this weakness. And now best move by black is h6. Best by white is bishop e5. So this is still to assume that white will play their very best moves, because right now your position is comfortable. You have to know, if you've been playing this line against your opponent, your position is just more comfortable. a6, the plan that we mentioned before, you know, b5, b4, queen a4, and so on. After a6, let's have a look at this move. Rook d to e1, queen c4. Earlier we went through queen swap. Best move actually is queen to e3. But at least now we know exactly what to do in case they swap our pieces, and why we were so confident in swapping pieces. Queen to e3, we play knight to g4, it comes with a fork, and now the queen will have to move again. If the queen goes to f4, for example, then that's a blunder, because knight takes bishop, and if pawn takes back, then we win a free queen. If queen takes back, then we have bishop f6, which comes with a skewer, and we will have double attack on d4. We will be winning the d4 pawn, and that is a just crashing advantage then. If rook takes back, then we have bishop d6, making a skewer to rook and queen. So that is a blunder. So back at this position, after knight to g4, what happens if the queen moves to g3, getting away from the same rank of the opponent queen? We still take the bishop. In this case, the pawn can take the knight, but we play bishop to b4. We are finally now capitalizing on this knight. We are pinning the knight. The knight can't move, otherwise we win the exchange. There's no compensation for white to give us the exchange. After rook to e3, we still go for it. Bishop takes, rook takes, and we win the pawn in a2. We've got much better position, material advantage. White's got no attack. We're threatening to take another pawn, and we'll stop the line here. Right, back at this position. After h6 and white's best move, bishop e5, and black continues with a6. Let's mention one more time that bishop takes f6 is really bad, because then bishop takes back. Black is much better, because the d4 pawn is a weakness, since it cannot be protected by another pawn. And in that case, in that scenario, like bishop takes, we have a simple plan, which is the same as before. Queen c4, we're confident to go to the endgame. And if the queen were to move away, we will take bishop takes d4 will be fine. If the queen stays and controls the pawn, we can play queen to b4 with an attack on this pawn and more pressure on c3, and we're completely winning. So back at this position, bishop f6 is wrong. Let's have a look at this line. We talked about the plan, but after bishop takes, after rook to e1, in this case we can play queen to b6, comes with an attack on the pawn and an attack on this pawn. So if white plays pawn to b3, we simply play queen to d4. Here again, if bishop takes, and white plays a3, in this case a3 is actually possible. So the bishop takes f6 move only makes sense if white has this idea of playing a3, which was not possible before, because we could have taken, as mentioned a few times already, but now it is possible, and white might want to try just a completely different approach, start pushing the pawns on the queen side maybe. Now we play b5. b4 cannot be played simply because we have too much attack on c3. After a move like knight e2, for example, knight is trying to go to b4. Black continues with a5. So black now could have the same idea as we mentioned before in the previous plan, queen c4 and so on. Also because we have so much pressure on d4. Let's see what happens if white stays with the queen on the board and plays a move like c3, creating this pawn structure that he should have done, that he should have created before. This is just penalizing move because the knight can't move now. We will go on with the same plan, attacking these two. And after queen takes back, this time we can take with the pawn because of this particular structure. The knight can't move anywhere. So now we are nullifying the value of an entire piece. Yeah, so a move like rook to b1 now, the idea of developing the rooks, to give up the pawn, trade the pawn and then put the rook on an open file, is met by rook c to b8. And this is basically the last thing I want to mention, is how the Nc3 move wasted that tempo that was enough for us to advance our pawns and claim control of the queen side, because now no move for white is going to be enough. White just played the move c3 too late. He should have played it before. Even knight to c1 now, trying to go for this, still doesn't work. Black continues with rook to a6, the idea of doing a rook lift, of course, and now either b4 or b3 doesn't make a difference because we're still going to take. So b3 we take, b4 we take en passant. So let's say b3, or let's say b4, whatever, en passant. And now knight takes is met by rook a to b6. and we won the game. If the knight moves, we can just take the rook for free, and if the rook protects the knight, we can just attack the knight with the pawn, so the pawn is pinned. So after b4 and take en passant, white can take with the rook, but even then we take the rook, knight takes back, rook to b6, attacks the knight. We're threatening to win the knight. It cannot be protected due to the pin, and it cannot even move somewhere like a5 or c5 because of the checkmate threat, and a1 also loses to rook. So knight c1 is stupid because you're going to be able to pin the knight and also put more pressure over the knight with the bishop. So the only move is knight to d2. Now black plays rook to c6 and goes on to a winning endgame. It is impossible to defend this pawn. c4 gets taken.